Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin,
I'm Justin Clark.
and today we're discussing the future of gun control. So this is a topic that's extremely relevant right now, especially in the wake of two mass shootings, one in Dayton and one in El Paso. And it looks like this may be the final straw for gun control, meaning it looks like politicians are actually going to make some moves to implement common sense gun laws. And it's not just on one side of the aisle, it looks like it's on both sides of the aisle. So I want to get into all the solutions that are being proposed, the pros and cons of those solutions. But I feel like because this issue is so fraught, we need to start with some ground level facts just to get a sense for, what the actual state of gun violence in the US is. And so I'll just list a couple facts that I think are relevant. So first of all, at a high level, overall violence has gone down significantly in the past decade in the US. So it's not like there's much more gun violence and gun deaths now than there used to be. In fact, it's actually a lot safer than it used to be. Likewise,
And this is per capita or overall? Or
both.
maybe both, okay.
Although I will say that in the last couple years, gun violence has gone up a little bit. But if you look at the last decade, it's significantly gone down.
Okay.
Likewise, gun sales are also not greatly higher in the last couple of years than they have been. And in fact, there were more gun sales during the Obama era because a lot of, especially conservatives, were concerned that the liberals were going to implement tough gun laws. So they wanted to get their guns before those laws were implemented.
Mhm.
Now, those are sort of the positive indicators. The negative indicators are that even though overall violence is down, hate crimes are up. Also, mass shootings are up. So while you're less likely to die from, domestic violence now than in the past or from a mugging or that sort of thing, you're more likely to die from a mass shooting in 2019 than you were in 2009. And then the final stat that I'll say right now is that the U.S. has far more guns, both in total numbers and per capita, than almost any other country. And it also has by far more gun deaths overall and gun deaths per capita than any other country. I think Yemen is one of the only countries that has actually more gun deaths per capita than the U.S. So
That's crazy. And it's a war zone in Yemen. Like it's
exactly. So my
okay.
first question to you is, taking all these facts into account, why is there so much more gun violence in the US than in other parts of the world?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is such a multifaceted issue that it's hard to boil it down to one thing, but I have a couple of thoughts. The first thing to kind of piggyback off of what you're saying mass shootings are on the rise and hate crimes are on the rise. At the same time, this might be correlation, might be causation, I don't know. But there's an extreme mental health crisis in the US, and there's also a rise of extreme ideologies pretty
Hmm.
much everywhere, but especially in the US. So when you combine that with how easy it is to get access to guns, get access to assault rifles, military weapons, semi-automatics, all of these things, that just spells a recipe for disaster. And I think all of those things put into the same pot is kind of leading us to where we are today. So
Right.
that's what I would say. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Well, one fact that I found surprising is that most mass shooters do not meet the clinical requirements for having
Hmm.
mental health issues. And
Hmm.
that's from a New York Times report. And so mental health is definitely part of the issue, but I think you're right that it's such a multifaceted issue that we can't just say, oh, it's all young white guys who are doing what Trump has been saying through dog
Hmm.
whistles. Like, you cannot blame one person for something like this, and there have been mass shootings before Trump. So
Hmm.
obviously it runs deeper than that. And if you look at who, who are the typical mass shooters, they do tend to be younger white males
Mm-hmm.
who don't have a lot of opportunities in
Mm-hmm.
life, and they do tend to spend an inordinate amount of time on the internet and, places like 8chan, which at three of the recent mass shooters all had posted their acts
Like
of
their
violence.
manifesto, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they posted on
Yeah.
8chan, and the New York Times did a an interview with the founder of 8chan,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really interesting how he's kind of against it now because he sees the role that it's playing in the minds of
Mm-hmm.
these potential mass shooters. And on the message boards, they'll say things like, "Oh, I'm gonna beat this guy's high score, like his kill count." And it's kind of this
Wow.
like there's this community where people are so disaffected from society that they just have this embitterment. And I actually think Jordan Peterson put it the best, where he says they're out for revenge against God for the outrage of creation, for the outrage of being. Where it's
Wow.
like, I mean, and obviously this does not include all mass shooters, but
Mhm.
it does seem like there's a trend where some of these, a lot of times they have not been successful with women, and they have not been successful with getting a job. And the only
Yeah.
place where they are successful is, through, playing video games with their friends or on these message boards, and just sort of
Mm-hmm.
finding community where there used to not be any sort of community for these types of people to talk with one
Mm-hmm.
another. Like there have always been people who have a predilection to violence or who have mental health issues, but there wasn't always a good way for them to sort of get together and
Mm-hmm.
talk about it. So that is definitely part of the issue, but of course, it's so multifaceted that that's really just one element of it.
Yeah, it's maybe a big component of mass shootings, but there's also, again, way more gun deaths. Just regular
Yeah.
run-of-the-mill street gun violence is a that has more deaths per year than mass shootings. So it's
Hmm.
that part maybe boils down to the ease of getting guns and the ease of, and again, it could be a lot of social unrest in certain areas, that there's a lot of these communities like Baltimore that have just been, you know, affected by gang violence, for example, for a long time because there's been this systemic racism that basically just keeps people in their communities, and that's kind of the only way young kids can, get protection is to join a gang. So there's so many
Right.
issues here to discuss. So,
Yeah.
I don't know
So I think
which one to
we
focus on.
should break it down. So we already talked a little bit about mass shootings. The other most It's worth noting mass shootings are a very small percentage of overall gun deaths. It's
Mhm.
about 0.1% of all gun deaths in the US are from mass shootings. So the
Mhm.
vast majority of them are actually suicides. That's the biggest number.
Mhm.
The next biggest number are gang related violence, and a lot of it is black on black crime in
Mhm.
these inner cities where there's these cycles of violence. And I called my cousin, who is a lawyer who used to work in the gang unit in the DA in Chicago, south side of
Wow.
Chicago, and he talked about how one of the big problems with Chicago is that the laws are really strict in Chicago for obtaining guns, but you
Mhm.
can drive just a couple miles to Indiana and there's essentially no gun laws at all. I mean, they're,
Mhm.
very minor. And there's also gun shows in Indiana that create a loophole because you can
Mhm.
buy guns at these gun shows without providing any sort of identification, no background check. And they even have this process where kids, like 12, 13-year-old kids who are in these gangs, they're called scrapers, where they'll basically scrape off the serial numbers of the
Mhm.
rifles. And, because it's a felony offense to take off the serial number from a rifle, um, which is why they have these small kids do it, because they're not going to get,
Yeah.
very minimal time in jail, if any.
Mhm.
And it's this cycle where having a gun and being able to protect yourself, your friends, your family, that's such a primal desire. But then
Hmm.
part of this gang culture is also you get more status if you shoot an opposing gang member, or if you
Hmm.
actually make a violent act that you're like sort of known for, that boosts up your status in that community. And
Hmm.
so status and protection are really the two key drivers of why gun violence is so prevalent in these areas. And it creates a cycle of violence because if to gain status you need to shoot opposing members, then they're going to want retribution. They'll try to shoot you, then you got to get retribution against them, and it's really hard to break that cycle.
Hmm. Yeah, and you can't even leave. I mean, there's retaliation if you want to try to leave a gang. So it's hard once you're in, and you make these decisions to join a gang at the age of 12. Like you were saying, these little kids are probably parts. They're probably a part of these gangs, and they can't get out of it. There's
Hmm.
literally, I mean, no way without resorting to some sort of violence or without worrying the rest of your life that there's going to be retaliation from 2 decades ago. They'll just come somewhere and shoot up your house with your family. Like it's kind of a terrible situation, and
Right.
it's hard to think of what a solution to that would be. Obviously, there are policy changes that need to take place. It's not necessarily going to be fixed through like stricter policing or something like that. Like there needs to be better social mobility so people don't have to resort to joining these gangs at an early age.
Yeah,
So,
and I found it interesting that it's not like there's more crimes in the US than in other countries. In fact, there are
mhm.
far more burglaries and assaults even in the Netherlands than in the
Wow.
US, which I was surprised by.
Hmm.
However, when there is a burglary or an assault, that is far more likely to end in death in the US than in anywhere in Europe. So
Mm.
the crimes that do happen, they're far more lethal in the US because there are so many guns around and because the gun culture runs so deep. So
Mm.
I do want to start now talking a little bit about what's being proposed. And specifically, how does the left view this issue and how does the right view this issue? And then maybe we can triangulate to what makes the most sense regardless of party politics. So it seems like people on the left they almost don't want to get into the details of it. They just point to a
Mm.
graph that shows number of guns, number of gun deaths, number of guns equals gun death. Therefore, get rid of all the guns. And that's basically as far as it typically gets with a lot of people on the
Ah.
left. And the
Mhm.
problem with that, there's a couple problems. One is that there's already 300 million guns in the US. So even if you stopped the sale of new guns, there's almost as many guns as there are people in the US.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Another
Mm.
problem is that the Second Amendment runs so deep in so many people that if you try to take people's guns away, if you try to take away those 300 million guns, it could create a civil war. I mean, the amount of people that have their whole identity around gun ownership and that wear t-shirts that say "come and take it," and it's
Yeah.
just like that is not going to play well if you try to take away all Americans' guns.
Hmm.
So then the question is, okay, so restricting new gun sales won't really solve the full problem, and then uh, taking away guns is not really feasible. Then what do you
Hmm.
do? So some things that have been suggested are an assault rifle ban, right?
Yeah. And that seems really straightforward. Like I don't know what's controversial about this. Maybe this is my own bias leaking in, but do you need an assault rifle? Like, well, I don't know.
Yeah, I
I don't know
have
what your thoughts are, but
yeah, I have similar thoughts I think to you, which is that it is a weapon of war, and in that sense, it's not like you need this hunting or for self-defense. You can just use a typical
hmm.
handgun or rifle, hunting rifle would be enough. However, Sam Harris makes the point that the only real advantage of an assault weapon over a handgun is it's much more accurate at range. So at distances of 100 meters or more, you can
Yeah.
have more accurate gunfire with an assault rifle than the best marksman in the world with a handgun. But at close range, there's really no real benefit of an assault rifle over a handgun. In fact, there's even some advantages of having a handgun because it's easier to conceal, first of all. So
Hmm.
you could get into like a school or a movie theater much more easily.
Hmm.
And it's also it's harder to take someone down who has a pistol than a rifle because you could just sort of like grab the barrel.
Right.
So
Yeah.
and then the final point is that if you just look at the numbers, there are far more even mass shootings that are performed with a handgun than with an assault rifle. It's just that the most highly publicized ones
Hmm.
tend to be with an assault rifle. But I will say that one thing that Sam Harris leaves out that I think is an important point is the coolness factor of an assault rifle for these kids that grew up playing video games and are basically bragging to their friends on 8chan about these
Hmm.
shootings. Like Scott Adams had an idea. He was like, what if we just required that all assault rifles were painted pink? What do you think that? You think they would still use them? Like, it's
After painting them black again, maybe.
right. It's not like a serious solution, but it does point at an interesting fact, which is that
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
part of the reason it's not because they're more effective, it's because they look badass to the people that use them.
Hmm.
So personally, I think it makes sense to do an assault rifle ban. We should just we should just be aware that it's more of a symbolic step than something that's actually going to curtail gun violence. Because like we said earlier, it's only 0.1% of all gun deaths in the U.S. that are mass shootings, and it's a subset of that that are with assault rifles.
Yeah. So, what are some of the other proposals? So there's the assault rifle ban. I know
Yeah,
I listened to Bernie Sanders on Joe Rogan's podcast the other day, and he was talking about making sure we close this gun show loophole,
yeah,
which
that's a big one.
I totally agree with. Because when even if the gun show people don't want to sell their guns to some individual, anybody, like if you buy guns from somebody who bought from a gun show, so like a secondary sale, that person, even if they didn't meet the federal like FBI requirements of owning a gun, it's totally legal to sell the gun to them since it's secondary market. So there's just a couple of things you can do, like banning that loophole and also banning assault rifles. And I'm curious what other, first steps you think we could take.
Yeah, so some of these steps seem just like total no-brainers.
Hmm.
Everyone should have a background check, and if you have a criminal record, or if people have
Hmm.
restraining orders out against you, or if you've beaten your wife in the past or whatever, you should not own a gun. That seems very clear.
Yeah.
Um, and I think having these background checks across all states, so you can't just drive over to the nearby state, is so
Hmm.
key. So that's like a clear no-brainer. Some other things that have been proposed, like just today, Chuck Schumer proposed that there is a body armor regulation. So you wouldn't be able to buy body armor unless you went through some, much heavier vetting process that like you have to state an actual reason why you need this body armor. So that was, I thought, an interesting gun control measure. There's also, in Australia, they bought back people's guns and then destroyed them, but I doubt most
Yeah, I don't
Americans
see that being
know.
effective here.
No. Really, the one oh sorry, one other thing I'll say before I'd say the one that I think is actually the best solution is red flag laws. So red flag laws are interesting because it essentially allows you to tell the police if you think someone close to you is not fit to own a gun. So let's say you're a woman and your husband has been, threatening you with violence and talking about how he's going to get a gun. You could then essentially call the cops and they could revoke his Second Amendment rights. So
Interesting.
that's
I
one.
wonder if that could backfire where the, the either the male, let's say a husband calls the cops and tells them his wife is acting dangerously, so then he can be aggressive towards her. There's
Yeah, I don't, yeah, I'm mixed on this as well because if you implement something like that, you're pretty much guaranteeing that some not insignificant amount of people will have their rights removed without a fair process.
Yeah, I could see this being a thing where like gangs or maybe it wouldn't trickle to the gang violence, but I was originally thinking maybe one gang would like name all of the other gangs or all the other members of an opposing
Right,
gang and like
right.
get them banned. So it seems like it would be used more for making sure other people don't have guns so you can be more violent. Um,
It
maybe
could
not
be.
more. I don't
It's
know.
hard to say.
Yeah, that's a hard question, but I don't
And then
think that that
the
would be a bad
alternative
one.
to a red flag law is basically using data science and predictive crime
Mm.
to say, okay, this person fits the profile. They tend to hang out with known gang members, and
Uh,
based on where they've been, they are highly likely to commit an act of violence. And they already have predictive policing methods like this. And a lot
mhm.
of times people have cried out about them being racist and stereotyping. So that also has some serious drawbacks. And I don't know about you, but I'm not too keen on living in the world of Minority Report where they can arrest people before they've committed a crime.
Yeah.
Given quantum uncertainty, it just seems like that's a that's a dark rabbit hole to go down.
Mhm.
Even though it seems fairly likely that some version of that will happen in the future.
Mhm.
Um, but anyways, I want to tell you about the solution that I actually think makes the most sense. And I haven't heard anyone propose this, but this is just my own idea. Is
Okay.
well, the first part is something that's been proposed, which is you need a license to own a firearm. And the stringency should be similar to that of owning a pilot's license. Dozens of hours of training, safety
Mhm.
training, tactical training, and but here's the key that hasn't been proposed. If this training was not done by the company that sells the guns or the gun shop, but if it was instead some sort of third party entity that did not have any incentive to sell you guns. So the incentive is purely to train people to the best of their ability and also to flag anyone who they think is suspicious as far as why they want a gun. So if you could basically make people go through this training process and then, you have like ex-army guys or whatever who are the
Mhm.
instructors and they, through their training they get to know these people and they say, "Hey, this guy's probably not someone who should be owning a gun. That guy's fine. This guy just wants to protect his family." But I think
Mhm.
that kind of a system would be really good because, I
Mhm.
feel like that person would have the best sense of if someone is not well to be owning a gun, and you'd sort of remove
Yeah.
the incentives that are currently messing things up where a gun shop wants to sell you a gun, so they kind of try to go through the paperwork as easy as possible.
Mhm. I would be curious to see what happens in that case with all of the existing guns. So, do we basically have a time period, like within the next 5 years, anyone who wants to keep their permit needs to go through this rigorous training, for example, or prove that you can pass, some sort of tests with your guns? Like,
Yeah,
because it seems
it's
like a
that's
big
tough.
problem is that the guns are already out there. Like
Right.
it's not a big issue of like buying new guns. I mean, yes, people are still buying new guns, but we have more guns than people in the country right now, so it's not
Right.
particularly hard to, or people probably already have their guns for the most part.
Yeah. Although I still think that we should do what we can to prevent
Hmm.
violence, even if it's not a full solution.
Yeah, we need to take the steps in the
Yeah.
right direction.
And if you did have a law where, for instance, you can't just give your guns to someone, and in most states, like in California, that's true. You have to go through a licensed gun broker. You can't just give your gun to your girlfriend or your friend or your brother. You have to actually
Hmm.
go through a licensed broker. If you made that law the same in all states
Hmm.
and you required training for all new gun owners, then you may not make much of a big difference in, like, the next couple of years, but in the next couple of decades it would be a huge difference, because any new person who owns a gun would have to go through the training. And as the owners of these 300 million guns start to get old and die off, they can't just give it to their kin. At least legally they can't. So the
Hmm.
new kin would have to go through the training themselves to
Yeah.
obtain so I think that would be a good sort of step in the right direction.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Um,
could see that. And then really, I think banning certain types of weapons like the automatics, the semi-automatic stuff like that would be a good way to go going forward.
well,
The thing
automatics and semi-automatics are distinct.
that's true. Okay, so semi-auto,
Banning semi-automatics, I think, is a non-starter, just given like what percentage of guns are
I guess
semi-automatic.
some pistols are even
Oh
semi-auto.
yeah,
Yeah, I guess assault rifle is the big one, but there's
right.
also the thing that I was also thinking of is there I was I was at dinner with a big group of people the other day, and there was this one guy that was talking about how in Missouri one time he was at some farm, and the owner of that farm had a 50 cal sniper rifle. And if you're on a, like if you don't know, a 50 cal sniper rifle is it has so much power it can literally blow up a car.
Whoa.
Um, yeah, and they were talking about and jokingly talking about how they just shot a lamb and it literally exploded into pieces.
Wow.
And this is one of the most powerful like sniper rifles there is to my knowledge. And like why do you need that? Like why do you
Right.
need that sort of gun? And that's the sort of thing that I think
I mean, for you
we
to
need to get rid of.
That's interesting. Well, let's talk about the scenarios where you would actually need that, because that gets into the sort of the mindset. So,
Hmm.
either something is seriously wrong with you if you need that for defense, or
Yeah.
like you think everyone's trying to get you. You think everyone's like, if you're in the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, or something is actually really wrong with society,
Hmm.
meaning doomsday. And this is a big motivator for why people buy guns is, and it's
Yeah.
not that far-fetched. Like, for instance, I live in California. If there was a
Hmm.
major earthquake, which we talked about in a recent episode, it could result in some looting, like people just going house to house, stealing all your stuff, maybe, you know,
Hmm.
sexually assaulting your loved
Hmm.
ones, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. And in that case, it's worthwhile to have the most powerful defense
Yeah.
that you could. So I guess like the doomsday is one situation where, yeah, you may actually want to have an AR-15 or a sniper rifle if it's that level of, like, messed up society. Um,
Hmm.
but to me, the core ethical case for why you should own a gun is that purely for self-defense in like a normal situation, like a home
Hmm.
entry sort of a thing. And
Right.
the prototypical example is if you're a young mother and a man breaks into your house with a knife and he's going to assault you,
Hmm.
but thankfully you have a gun and you shoot him. That's a totally ethically just case. And even
Hmm.
if you banned all guns, then you just have this like buff man coming in with a knife and a defenseless mother. Like, what is she
Hmm.
supposed to do? Like, karate chop him? Like, the
Yeah.
reason that guns are key is it gives you an advantage over brute strength, which has been the
Mhm.
dominating force up until guns were invented.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it gets people on an equal field, on an equal playing field when it comes to strength. But yeah, it's always good to think about those cases because I'm not saying that it's bad for everybody to own guns. Like I think it's actually probably a good thing to be able to have a pistol that you can protect your home,
Mm,
especially in the dead of night. Like if somebody is breaking into your house at night, they're most likely aware that somebody is in the house and they're
yeah.
prepared to act violently.
Hmm.
Personally, like I'm not afraid to say this, I would very easily, without hesitation, shoot a person that entered my house in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
because there's no reason that I should expect them to act cordially. And
Hmm.
I've heard people, I don't know who said this, but it was an interview I heard a while back where it was a left argument where they were basically saying, well, I would want to sit this person down and talk to them. Like, are you kidding me? Do you
Yeah.
think that that person is in the state of mind to be sat down and lectured about like why it is that they felt the need to enter your house that night? Like,
Right, right. Yeah, it's not like these mass shooters go in trying to talk. They don't have any demands. They just want to kill. And
yeah.
that is something that may happen. So preparing for the worst possible case scenario is not crazy, especially if you think that the worst case scenario is even worse than death,
Yeah.
which your loved ones getting harmed, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I actually, so partially for research for this episode, and partially for my own just feelings of wanting to be
Hmm.
able to protect my house and my family, I
Hmm.
went out and got a gun
Okay.
yesterday. So I thought it'd be interesting to tell the process of what it actually takes to get a gun.
Okay.
So I went to my local gun shop in Culver City
Hmm.
and I decided on the type of gun I want, which is just a simple 9mm pistol by Heckler and Koch, this
Hmm.
German company, which was mentioned in this Murakami novel that I'm currently reading as like a really capable,
Yeah.
well-made pistol. It's the only reason why I got that particular gun. And then I was like, okay, great, I'd like this gun. And they said, okay, have you taken your safety test? And I was like, no. And they said, okay, here's your test. So they give me this multiple choice. It's 30 questions. And they say you have to get at least 23 of them right to pass the test. So I hadn't done any preparation at this point, like thinking about gun law. And by the way, I'm in California, which is one of the strictest gun states in the country. And so I take this test. I got 26 out of 30. So I got four of them
Hmm.
wrong. So I passed. And then they said, okay, no, we need to, prove your identity. So I gave them my license and I gave them my car registration. They scanned it. While they were scanning it, they taught me basic gun instructions. So they taught me how to lock the gun so that it can't be fired. And they taught me how to load the gun, how to unload the gun, and just basic safety precautions, how to store it. It only took like
Hmm.
maybe 1 minute, the whole safety instructions thing.
Wow.
And then I paid for the gun and I left. And they said that I had to wait 10 days until I can pick it up. But so you can't
Okay.
do something rash in the moment. Like I need a gun now and then you go do something rash. You have to wait at least
Yep.
10 days, but you cannot wait longer than 30 days or else you have to redo the whole like background check process.
Hmm.
So I actually thought this was a fairly good process, but it
Yeah.
still is totally inadequate from my point of view to what it should be.
Hmm.
And keep in mind, this is like the most strict possible way to get a gun.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's so much easier than getting my driver's license, where I actually had to take classes and like, do
Hmm.
like hear instructions that were more than 60 seconds long.
Yeah.
Like I feel like the right process would be to go like do a whole training course
Yeah.
and then maybe you need to wait longer than 10 days and maybe you do need to provide a reason for why you should own a gun and maybe you should get a character reference from someone who lives with you
Yeah.
or something like that.
Hmm.
But it was interesting, just the process even in California is really easy, far easier than it's like on par with getting a medical cannabis recommendation. It's like, and it's way easier in other states. I mean, in other states, you don't have to show anything. You just go in and put down your money and you get it. So,
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Did you get a chance to go to a shooting range and test it out or?
No, because I don't have it yet. I'm still in the 10-day period.
Oh, I see. So you bought it and then it's there at the store still, or can
Yeah,
you? Okay, I see.
yeah.
Yeah, it's. I went to a shooting range once, and the first thing I shot was a 358 or 357 Magnum revolver pistol. I mean, it's so powerful.
Yeah.
I don't think most people realize how much power is in your hands when you're holding a gun, and when I felt that, like it scared me. Like
Hmm.
I was a little terrified when I shot it. Like I was shaking because it I had so
Oh
much
yeah.
adrenaline running through my system. I set it down and had to, take some deep breaths. Some other pistols are not as powerful as that revolver, but
Yeah.
I
It's
think
so loud too.
yeah, I think one of the things that's the issue is the fact that people do feel so powerful with the gun. They feel like they're in control of a
Hmm.
situation and they can command a situation because they own a gun.
Yeah. Well, I've heard about that as being a big driver of suicide among the same types of demographics of people who commit mass shootings, which are
Hmm.
typically white men who feel like they're losers in society, and
Hmm.
they see their gun as their protector. This is their this is where they get their power. This is where they get their
Hmm.
protection. They
Hmm.
polish it every night. They go to the gun range. And when they have those times of distress where their wife just left them or they just lost their job or whatever it is, they turn it on themselves and they kill themselves. And
Hmm.
so that's sort of a separate issue in my mind than the other types of gun violence. Like,
Right.
because I don't know, personally, I kind of feel like you should be able to kill yourself whenever you damn well please.
Yeah. I mean,
Even, you know,
I'm with you. That's something we talked about in the future of death, I
hmm.
think, if anybody's interested. Because I mean, you know, but you can get our opinions on that episode, but I agree. Like you have your right to that. It doesn't necessarily constitute gun violence. I don't
Right.
think. Like
And that's not
there
to
are other
say
ways
that
to
we
do it.
shouldn't still implement all of the mental health,
Yeah. Yeah.
resources and everything
Hmm.
that's related there.
Yeah.
Um,
It would be nice, just on a side note, it would be good if there was a way to have a system, sort of like how Switzerland has their heroin thing where you can go in, get free heroin, but you also have to enroll in a treatment plan to like become not
right.
addicted. I would be curious to see what a situation would be if suicide was legal and sanctioned by organizations. They're like, okay, you come in, you want to commit suicide. You have to go through this process before you can go through with committing suicide, for
Hmm.
example. And that, I mean, that might be a quick policy change to get that sort of thing down because we can actually get people the help they need. And we can make sure that people are given, I think people commit suicide with guns because it's likely that there's no pain involved.
Right, right.
So, anyways, that was sort of a tangent, but
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about some of the high-tech gun solutions that are being proposed because this doesn't
mm,
tend to get as much attention. But there are, personalized guns with biosensors have been proposed. And this is essentially like fingerprint technology where only you can fire the gun because it's personalized to your biometric data. So that
mm,
would prevent things like, your kid getting a hold of your gun and shooting you or shooting himself.
mm,
So that's an interesting solution. It's also worth noting that this is something that Sam Harris talks about. The NRA has this as a talking point, but it is statistically true, which is that if you own a gun and a swimming pool in your house, the swimming pool is 100 times more likely to kill your kid than the gun.
wow.
So that does just put it into a little bit of perspective of the relative risk. But of course,
Hmm.
you should do everything in your power to prevent that happen, to prevent either the death in the swimming pool or the death in as a result of the
Hmm.
gun.
Right.
So the biometric data is one way to do that. And then
Hmm.
if there was a true alternative to a gun that was just as effective. Like you could imagine something that like you shoot it at someone and they immediately become unconscious without dying. Like
Yeah.
no matter what sort of body armor they have or anything, like you shoot this person with this like sound wave or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and they just get knocked out immediately. If there were that sort of technology, then I think the conversation would change dramatically from the self-defense perspective. But the next thing I want to talk about is, self-defense is like the most obvious ethical case, but it's not necessarily what the founders intended with the Second Amendment. Because if you read the Second Amendment, okay, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So that's the actual language of the Second Amendment. And a couple things to note there. First is a well-regulated militia. So right there in the Second Amendment is, hey, we got to regulate this stuff. It's not like everyone can run around with rocket launchers,
Yep, right, yeah.
I mean, even though rocket launchers didn't exist back then. But, and then the other part that's interesting is necessary to the security of a free state. So this sort of gets at the idea of it's not for self-defense, really. It's so that you can sort of fight back against a potentially corrupt authoritarian federal government or like invasion by another country. And this is sort of a separate issue from self-defense, which is how do we maintain our democracy even if there's a corrupt government in place, or even if other countries try to come and infiltrate our government and tell us what to do. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on, is this even relevant anymore, given that there's like drone strikes and SWAT teams and facial recognition, and like, is it a valid argument to bear arms for that reason?
Yeah. So first, short, no, I don't think that's a valid thing anymore, because seriously, even if you got 1,000, if you got the entire city of Los Angeles organized, the government would still crush them. If everyone had an assault rifle in the city of Los Angeles, there are bombs, there are drone strikes. You don't survive that. You don't survive against the high-tech weapons the government has.
But don't you think it would also make it more difficult for an authoritarian government to take control, especially if not every gun is logged in a registry, which is the case right now? There's a lot of just unregistered guns floating around, and this is kind of like what happened in Vietnam, guerrilla warfare, where it does make it a lot more difficult when you can go into civilian houses and you never know if there's going to be someone, standing there with a gun.
Yeah, I think the military is so highly trained in these situations, we still don't stand a chance. Like literally, so Vietnam was kind of the first time we experienced that, but there's been a lot of experience the military has gained through the fighting in Afghanistan, Iraq, and I particularly hear these stories about Ramadi. I think this was in the early 2000s when they were
the ISIS
over there.
stronghold.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you walk into any house, you have no idea what's on the other side of the door. Yes, there's intelligence going on and there's intelligence operations, but it's really imperfect information. The amount of information that the US has about its own citizens is probably much higher than we have about Iraqi civilians on their turf. So I still think there's literally no chance in the world that we could stand up against the government unless there were factions of our own government that broke off and we had, some of those weapons. But if there are if we have no weapons that are in the military arsenal right now, like I said, no chance. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, which is kind of terrifying also, just to know that it don't stand much of a chance. I mean, to really stand a chance, you'd have to own some serious tech, like black helicopters and plutonium and so I agree. I mean, and it's worth noting that the real argument now is different than what the founders intended. The real argument now is more about self-defense and also the freedom of hunting, right? Hunting is a big
Yeah,
part of our culture,
yeah,
and any gun that's good enough to kill an animal is good enough to kill a human. So
right.
unless you're going to ban all hunting rifles, you're not really addressing the gun issue.
Hmm.
Um, something else that's been suggested is magazine limits, which is sort of it's a good step
Yeah,
where, like in California, you can't have a gun that has more than 10 rounds in it in the
right.
magazine. Other states, it can be as much as 100. So I think getting everyone to that, sort of level would be good. Um,
Hmm.
so I think it might be a good time, unless you have something else you want to discuss, maybe we should get into the future scenarios now.
Yeah, so I would just say one more thing, and maybe we talk a little bit about how other countries are
Okay,
doing
yeah.
their gun control. And, there's a lot of different countries. The two that stuck out to me were Japan and Germany.
Yes, yes.
So J
Oh, yeah.
Japan, Japan's gun control is no guns, no guns, no swords. Like it's very, very
Well, there is,
ill.
you can get a gun, but it's a really onerous
Yeah,
process.
right. Yeah. So that was a broad statement, but it boils down to like it's extremely, extremely difficult to get a gun in Japan. It's
Hmm.
one of the lowest crime, like gun murders per capita in the world, I think,
Hmm.
just because there are just so few guns. And there are some issues with like the Yakuza mafia. Or I think that's
Hmm.
the Japanese word for mafia. I'm not exactly sure, but
Yeah. Well, the thing, I don't know if you're about to touch on this, but the interesting thing about Japan is that, a lot of people will say, oh, it's not the fact that we have so many guns in America, and it's not the divisiveness of our political parties. Really, it's these damn video games that these kids are playing. And that's why. So we don't need to ban guns at Walmart. We just need to take the video games off the shelf for a couple of weeks, and that'll totally solve the problem. And you know what? We can solve the opioid epidemic. We just gotta hide the DVDs of A Star Is Born, and
uh,
then we'll. So, but the interesting counter to that is Japan and South Korea,
yeah.
because in
Hmm.
Japan and South Korea there are much higher rates of playing violent video games than in
Hmm.
the U.S., and yet there are virtually no, mass shootings,
Hmm.
whereas it's, become much very prevalent in the US relative to the rest of the world. So
Hmm.
the video game argument, I think we can debunk. It may be,
Right.
I mean, for sure, it's a contributing factor. If you're someone who already feels like a loser, you hate your life, you're a young male, none of the girls are giving you the time of day, and then you're spending all your free time shooting people in Call of Duty, that is certainly going to have a role to play because the contents of your consciousness are what rise to the top
Hmm.
when you're deciding what to do. I mean, that's just the way that life
Hmm.
experience works. So yeah, I thought that was a good
Hmm.
counterexample.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So that is a situation that I don't think we'll ever see in the U.S.
Hmm.
Just because we're not going to pull the guns from, 300, or I don't know how many Americans own guns, but we're not going to pull all of those guns from people. But
Right.
the last country that I'll talk about is Germany. And I find Germany interesting is because they have one of the highest weapons per person in the world, but also one of the lowest on gun crime.
Hmm.
Um, but the reason this is the case is because they went through a series of shootings. I think it was back in the 90s, early 2000s, that caused a couple of the big political changes. But they first made a change that you basically, if you're under 25 and you're trying to get a gun for the first time, you go under rigorous mental a psychological evaluation.
Hmm.
And they also made a law where there's only one gun per person. So it's not like one person has all the guns in the world,
Interesting.
like 10 guns. And then if somebody shows any signs in the future of being mentally unstable at all, the person is brought in for further evaluation and that you can get rid of their gun.
Hmm.
And I just find them to be a model that we can probably move towards because they do have a lot of guns, but they also have very low gun crime.
Right,
Um,
right.
so that I think Germany was an interesting example, and I know there are some others like Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, Australia and New Zealand, they just don't have the same gun culture that the US has.
Mhm.
So it's a lot easier to pass gun control legislation there and not get
Right.
huge pushback. So I think that's the problem with drawing a correlation between what Australia and New Zealand are doing. And
Hmm.
the idea of only being able to own one gun, I think it's, limiting the amount of guns to some degree is a good thing. But
Hmm.
if you have a house that has two entrances where a criminal could come from either entrance and you would really only be safe, you really would only be, you would need to have two guns in order to feel safe because you don't know where in your house you're going to be when an intruder comes
Right.
in. I could see an
Hmm.
argument for owning, at least like, up to three or five guns, maybe. Maybe we cap
Hmm.
it at like three guns or five guns, um,
Hmm.
for the
Yeah.
self-defense reason.
Right.
Um, but then I think it's interesting what the other solutions are that are not gun control that are proposed to solve the gun violence issue. And these are
Hmm.
mostly solutions coming from the right. And so, one we already talked about, which is more mental health services. I think everyone can agree that that's something we should do. Another one that's been really controversial is the idea of having more security guards, especially in places like schools, movie theaters, whatever,
Hmm.
or actually arming teachers themselves. So, I wanted to
Yeah.
hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for like armed trained security guards and stuff in places. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it sounds good to arm teachers, but I think forcing teachers to go get, guns and have gun training, I think that would cause quite a few issues because I know that a
Yeah,
lot of teachers don't want that. I think forcing it would be more of a problem and do more harm than good. But
right.
it would ultimately, I mean, it's still the self-defense thing. Like if you're in a home, it's good to have a gun if somebody comes in and tries to hurt your family. It's the same sort of thing if you're in a school and, at that time, your kids, as a teacher, the kids are sort of like your family. You need to protect them.
Hmm.
But it doesn't necessarily need to be every teacher that owns one. But I think if a gunman is outnumbered quite a bit, there's like not a great chance that they're going to make it to, you know, killing a bunch of people in school.
Right. Plus, it's worth noting that almost all of the mass shootings from the 1970s to today have been in quote unquote gun free zones. So, by making a
Oh.
zone gun free, it actually becomes a much more attractive target to a mass
Hmm.
shooter. So, but you're right that most teachers do not want guns anywhere near it. Like, there's this
Yeah.
one stat that I shared with you, which is that asking teachers if they would feel more or less safe if teachers and staff members were armed, 58% of them said they would feel less safe. Only
Hmm.
20% said they would feel safer, and the other percentage aren't really sure.
Hmm.
So, but I think part of that's because teachers tend to be really liberal, so they tend to just feel like, oh,
Right.
if there's any guns, it's just going to create issues.
Right.
But I guarantee you, if an active shooter actually came into your school, you would not feel any any
Yeah.
safety from knowing that there's no guns anywhere on
Yeah.
campus. Like,
Yeah.
and it's all about having the right people that have them. Like, you don't want some mentally unwell teacher who's going to use it to threaten his students or something like that. But if you have a teacher who did 3 tours in Iraq and is a totally upstanding citizen, like, I think it makes sense for that person to
Hmm.
have a gun. The other thing that has not been uh, proposed at all, but I think is relevant when we think of far future, is robot security, right? Like if you put a robot at every entrance of a school that has facial recognition that basically says if someone comes to the door who is armed and they're not like a verified like police officer or whatever,
Hmm.
then that person will be subdued, whether like if they're shot by the robot or whatever.
Yeah, the being shot by the robot makes me like that gives me pause, but
Yeah.
I think that in general that could be a very good way to screen for people coming somewhere, like coming
Hmm.
into whether it's a big train terminal or a movie theater or something like that. It's just better safety mechanisms in place. It's more preventive than having guns. And I think these preventive measures, and maybe this is something we can talk about in our scenarios, but I think preventive measures are probably the best way to go when it comes to
Hmm.
some of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess the final thing is because a lot of these mass shooters seek fame and notoriety, the less we
Hmm.
talk about them individually, the better. So not naming
Yeah.
them, not
Hmm.
giving them any sort of glory,
Yeah.
that's also key.
Hmm.
But yeah, let's get into the future scenarios.
Cool.
All right, Justin, what is the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario.
Yeah. So in my worst case scenario, the first thing is we don't do anything about gun control. It pretty much stays the way it is. It's super easy to get guns. And also, this is sort of focused on the US because other countries tend to have this more figured out than we do. Um, but at the same time that we do nothing about gun control, we have more extreme ideology spreading. The mental health crisis gets worse and worse. We have political situations and social, cultural situations that keep people in these loops of violence, like the gangs we talked about, or keeps people feeling like they're disenfranchised and sort of, not part of society and ostracized by society, all of that stuff.
Hmm.
I think if all of these things happen, it could lead to a situation where there are like little baby militaries, like in conjunction with 8chan and some of these forums. If people like this get together and they coordinate their attacks, like we could see these sorts of mass shootings and this sort of gang violence rise to a level that is unheard of.
Yeah.
So I think that that's sort of the worst case is it just continues to escalate further and further to the point where the US is a war zone, sort of like a Yemen, for example. And it could even
Hmm.
get to the point where it's like there is literally a civil war in the US because,
Yeah.
everyone has these extreme views. It's like my way or the highway, and then everyone else is, fighting against that, and then it just resorts to violence and it's that's sort of what I'm thinking in the worst case.
Yeah. Yeah, my worst case is two part, and they're sort of both extremes of the gun control issue. So the
Hmm.
first part is pretty much exactly what you were stating, which is that
Hmm.
if things keep getting worse, if there continue to be fewer and fewer opportunities for young men growing up in society, especially as automation, moves and progresses,
Hmm.
and they're not able to earn a living, if there's no sort of basic income, so they can't move out of their mom's basement, and they're
Hmm.
just perceived as losers, especially because the culture of America is very much you're either a winner or you're a loser. It's not like these Scandinavian countries where everyone's just a person who has value. It's a very stark divide in America,
Hmm.
from the culture. So if that continues and there isn't gun control, I think, like you said, there could be, these people could find communities of other hateful people, hateful men online, and then they could commit some serious crimes. Like I could see like them getting really upset at private companies. We've already had people who have gone and tried to bomb like BuzzFeed and Apple and stuff like that,
Wow, yeah.
because they get so pissed that they haven't been, or someone came to get Google because his YouTube channel got shut down because he had hateful rhetoric, and so he drove all the way over there to do something. He had weapons with him. So you could imagine that sort of situation if there is nothing done with gun control, but I would say, more importantly, if there is nothing done to solve the underlying root cause of why there's so much anger and hostility for these young white men, and to gang members who aren't always white men, and to people who kill themselves. There's really like multiple issues at multiple types of gunmen that we need to consider. It's not like one size fits all. Yep. The other part of my worst case is if there's much too aggressive gun control measures, and it would spark a civil war because we're trying to take away all the guns.
Yeah.
And that's something that, people on the right have made loud and clear, that if people come to take their guns, they're not going down without a fight. And if you had, especially if the government was actually corrupt, like if it was a true fascist regime and they went door to door taking people's guns, that would be also a horrible situation, because we would be more powerless to the authoritarian government, and it would just, a lot of violence would ensue from trying to take people's guns. So in my view, the worst case, whether there's much too extreme gun control, like taking people's guns, that would result in a lot of deaths. Or if nothing is done about gun control and nothing is done about the root causes of why there's so much hatred and hostility and embitterment for society, that is also a worst case scenario.
Yeah. I'm curious what your thoughts are then on the best case.
Best case scenario.
Yeah, so the best case is we solve the root cause. We don't solve the symptoms of the cause. Like banning assault rifles, bump stocks, like that's all great. I think makes sense that we should do that, especially because it eliminates the frequency with which people can reload, and it also makes it less cool,
Yeah.
So I think that's good, but it really doesn't solve the core issue. If we make changes so that young men do have more opportunities to find fulfillment in life, I think that is the best case scenario. And I think part of that would be a universal basic income, like Andrew Yang has proposed, where when you turn 18, and maybe it's tied to maintaining your good status as a citizen and not committing acts of violence, like whatever incentives are tied to that. If people can then depend on a certain amount of income per month, then they can actually feel like they have some independence. They can go pursue what they want to do in life. They don't feel like a total loser living in their mom's basement.
Yeah.
Honestly, maybe if they have a sex robot, they won't feel as inadequate
honestly,
with women. They won't, but yeah, I mean, and then the issue of fulfillment also, that's more of a cultural question, because in America, it's so much about like becoming rich and wealthy and powerful. And yet every year, a smaller and smaller percentage of people are able to actually, reach up to that tier of society.
Right.
So if we can sort of change the culture a little bit so that you feel like you have self-worth, even if you're not super wealthy and successful, maybe you just do what you're passionate about instead. Maybe you become a musician and you have a small following, but your friends like what you do, or you play video games and people follow you on Twitch or whatever, and maybe they're not as violent. Like, I don't know what the right solution is. Obviously, it's different for every single person, what they find fulfillment in. But I guess the final thing I'll say in my best case is, if there was some real coming of age sort of ceremony where you feel like you're part of society, and there's like some real tradition that is totally lacking in America, which is present in other places. I think that would also help. Like, honestly, if everyone took
Hmm.
mushrooms and went into the wilderness when they turned 18 or 25, like, I think that would make
Yeah.
us like, I think we would statistically see a decrease in all like types of
Yeah.
violence if we did that, for
Yeah.
instance. And if we had UBI so people can actually do what they want, that would be great. If we had a better education system, and if the media wasn't as divisive, you know,
Hmm.
those would all be steps in the direction of the best case scenario as I see it.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on most everything that I was going to say. So, just to kind of reiterate, yes, we need to solve the root cause. Like that's by far something that would be the best case. Like we don't need to worry about, who has guns, what like it would be way easier if we could just give people meaning in their life
Hmm.
and make sure people have mobility so they can move out of whatever social situation they're in or cultural situation or societal, we just need people to be able to move if they're not in a good situation.
Hmm.
Like in um, like gangs, for example, in inner cities, people should be able to get out, and it shouldn't be such an onerous process to
Hmm.
do that. Like it
And,
shouldn't be.
right. Plus, like with gangs in the inner city, a lot of these kids, they have this idea that they will never make any money unless they
Mhm,
sell drugs or they join a
mhm,
gang because there's just so few opportunities in these places where they live. So if you
mhm.
had some sort of universal basic income,
Yep.
then they wouldn't feel like they have no choices in life. And I guess another thing on drugs is if we did legalize and regulate all drugs, that
Mhm.
would seriously make a dent in gang violence because there would be no market for illegal drugs.
Yeah, I mean that's what a lot of the revenue sources of gangs are is drug violence, and then
Right.
one of the other revenue sources is guns. Like
Yeah.
if we can solve both of these things and regulate them properly, like we're probably not going to have those sorts of issues anymore. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think you kind of hit the nail on the head. The one thing I would say, if I were to really contrive ultimate best case is sort of a kumbaya situation where everybody just loves each other and nobody needs guns. We don't even need a military. Everyone is just, a human, an earthling that and we can all live in harmony. But
Yeah. I mean, I
obviously
think
that's
that would only be possible with gene editing technology so that you
yeah,
basically control so there's no psychopaths in the population.
yeah.
And
Or
that
like
brings with it other concerns.
yeah, that world would probably only exist in a virtual reality world.
Yeah. All right, should we move on to the
Yeah.
most likely scenario?
Yeah, let's do it.
Most likely scenario.
So I think it is likely that something will happen this time around. It feels different than the previous mass shootings. It feels like there are going to be changes that are made. I would guess that the most likely change is a ban on assault weapons.
Hmm.
Um, but like we said earlier, I don't know if that's going to make any sort of real impact in the actual
Gun
gun
violence as a
deaths. It's
whole.
such a
Yeah.
small percentage. Like, yeah, it might make people feel safer because maybe will be some fewer mass shootings, but I think even that is unlikely.
Hmm.
So I think my most likely scenario is assault rifles get banned or some similarly modest steps get taken in the direction of gun control. Maybe background checks will
Yeah.
become something that are required in all states.
Hmm.
But I think it will not fully solve the problem. So I think there's still going to be the yo-yo of the right and the left deciding what to do for the next decade or two until we really settle on our gun
Hmm.
policy.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, what I was thinking. I don't think there's going to be many sweeping changes that get pushed through in a Trump presidency. I do think some really common sense controls, like the assault weapon ban, like some mental health checks or background checks for all of this stuff. But I think there's just too much power that's given to the NRA right now that they're probably going to be able to sway some of these policies in what I would consider an unfavorable way. Favorable to the NRA, unfavorable to, pretty much everybody. So, yeah, I don't think we're going to start out well, but I do think, I think there will probably be at least one more mass shooting before something really happens. And I hope it's not soon. I hope it doesn't happen ever. But, it's one of those things that we're, I don't know. Maybe I'm more pessimistic about this because it seems like we run through this every time. It seems like, especially Vegas, that should have been more than enough for people to realize assault weapons are.
And that case is interesting because he actually had the full advantage that is given by an assault weapon. He was up in a window from long range. If he had just had a handgun, he wouldn't have done nearly as much damage. So I think that's a better example than Newtown or some of these other.
Yeah, and I think that should have been the catalyst, but it wasn't. So I'm sort of pessimistic about this, but I think eventually we will get to that point.
Yeah, and Elon Musk just endorsed Andrew Yang for president.
Really? I didn't see that one.
And
when did he do that?
Oh, just maybe yesterday. Elon for Yang was trending on Twitter. And
that's amazing.
And likewise, he also got enough delegates, or not delegates, sorry. He had enough donors and supporters to qualify for the next round of debates. So I think it's more and more likely that Andrew Yang will actually win. And if that happens, there will be some policy changes, specifically the freedom dividend, that I think will actually do more to stop these young male shooters from feeling like they should shoot up places than, these sort of corner case gun control measures would. Although I still think we should do this.
Gang violence.
And gang violence too, right? Because it gets at the core issue. It's not just a symptom of the issue or a symbolic gesture.
Yeah, I think that would be really good for the situation. So hopefully that does enter the likely case, the very, more than 50% likely case in the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that it's more likely than not that we'll have a UBI in the next, let's say, 12 years.
Yeah, 3 terms. I can see that.
Because I think the issue is coming to the forefront with Yang, and even if he doesn't win, the next president, I think, is probably going to have some version of it, or the one after that. But I don't think it'll be any longer than 12 years, just given the rate of technological change. And I think also, we are seeing a global economic slowdown. And part of that's the trade war. Part of that is just not having made that many innovations in areas outside of computer science and biology. So I think that's going to exacerbate this issue that we're talking about, where people feel like they're losers in society and they're trying to get back at life for being so hard on them. So, the bad is that, like you said, this is probably not going to be the last shooting, unfortunately. But on the good, I think that will mean that we are going to have to deal with this issue very soon. And we can't just keep kicking the can down the road. So in the short term, I'm not that optimistic, but in the medium term, I am optimistic about this.
We are all gathered here today.
I'm with you.
Very important.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. This has been the future of gun control.
What is currently happening,
and we'll see you next time.
What will inevitably happen.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Hey futurists, if you've made it this far, you might be wondering who created the Hence the Future theme song. It was created by the Walden Brothers, and you can find them on Spotify. The Walden Brothers also produced the sound bites for the worst case, the best case, and the most likely future scenarios. At Hence the Future, we're always looking for ways to improve the quality of our episodes and our predictions. To that end, we're building a team of researchers to curate the most authoritative and highly vetted sources as the foundation for every episode. If you'd like to support these efforts, you can donate a small monthly amount at anchor.fm/hencethefuture. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.